With the recent implementation of the Commander bracket system by Wizards of the Coast and the Commander format panel, I've decided to make a video putting all of my decks into the brackets that I feel like they belong in. Now, before we get into the ranking of my decks, let's first do a quick little rundown of the bracket system in general. So, I'm sure most of you all have seen or heard of the bracket system 100 million times by now. Every single content creator is talking about this, and for good reason. But we'll just go over the brackets super fast, and I'm gonna pull up. I have this the brackets pulled up by the Wizards of the Coast graphic, whatever. So number one, we have Exhibition. Ultra casual commander decks. These are decks that are heavily influenced by a theme. And the goal of the deck is not to necessarily win, it's more so to follow a theme and to kind of showcase that theme in more of like an entertaining fashion instead of like a winning intent. Now, bracket two is core, and very specifically, it says the average current pre-constructed deck. So obviously, not all precons are the same in terms of their power, and they recognize this. Wizards of the Coast recognize this rather. So they're talking about the average current precon, and I think this is where most decks are actually going to fall into. A lot of people play precons or like modified precons. Um, and a few key notes of this, like in exhibition rather, you don't have any mass land denial, no extra turn chaining, no 2 card infinite combos, no game changer cards, which I'll get to in a second, and then very few tutors. And in terms of the tutors, obviously it's not talking about like demonic tutor or enlightened tutor. It's talking about like very specific synergistic tutors or thematic tutors. Like, for example, running Entomb Reanimate is not really an exhibition type like card sequence, but running, for example, a trophy mage to in your artifact deck of like your like a collection of your fun swords deck or something like that feels way more thematic than what I mentioned prior to that. And core kind of falls into the realm more of I feel like in the context of a core deck, you could run Entomb Reanimate or something like that, or you could run a gamble in your like gambling, like dice rolling or coin flipping deck or something like that. And I feel like it would be a bit more fitting. But just like jamming a bunch of tutors, like efficient tutors, into it feels more like a bad faith, kind of like getting the unnecessary edge on precons. Uh, Tangent aside, we're going to move to three, which is upgraded. And this is basically talking about decks that are upgraded precons or decks that are akin to upgraded precons in terms of their power level and the intentionality in their deck building. So a lot of the times when people upgrade precons, they'll add very powerful cards, and those cards are accounted for in the three game changers requirement, or sorry, guideline rather. And this means that you can only have a maximum of 3 game changers. Now, that doesn't mean that a deck without game changers isn't powerful enough to be a 3, and this isn't necessarily purely based on power of these brackets, but it is a somewhat like a semi solid indicator on the matter. So, in terms of the game changers, you can have a maximum of 3, and this is where the late game infinite combos kind of roll into play. Like you could run a somewhat like a late game centered combo, like, oh, I'm playing Thassa's demonic consultation, but I'm gonna wait till turn 8 to do it. Like that's not what this is talking about. I don't think this is more talking about like a very expensive mana combo or a combo that is a lot harder to accomplish, whether it be because of variance or like the mana value of the combo itself, of course. And you could take into account like mana cheating, that stuff into play, but um yeah, this is more like less optimized game finishing combos, if that makes sense. So that is a bit of the distinction between 2 and 3 in terms of what is allowed. And a lot of this is like, this isn't like some cut and dry system where you have to follow everything about this. And if a website, I know that Wizards collaborated with like a lot of the popular deck building websites, and it's like if that deck building website calls your deck a 2, it doesn't mean it's a 2. It could be a 3 actually, but it just doesn't follow the criteria necessary, or it follows the criteria of a 2. It takes the minimum accounted criteria and then organizes it that way. And I'll get more into that in a sec. So after that, we have 4, and this is no restrictions other than the ban list. So it's very open. It's called the optimized bracket, and for good reason. This is your like classic super high power commander, but not quite CEDH. So everything is accounted for in terms of like there spare no resources in terms of the deck building process. The goal of this is to win, but it's still a casual deck when all is said and done. Now, bracket 5 is CEDH, and I'm very appreciative that they have their own bracket because there is a multiple, I think, significant distinctions. And you notice that it says no restrictions other than the ban list, which is the exact same as the optimized tier or optimized bracket rather. But in terms of the little sentence blurb, it says high power with a very competitive and metagame focused mindset. Now, I feel like a lot of people don't quite actually understand the distinction between casual and CEDH. They just think powerful deck is CEDH and then end of story. But CEDH has a few key signifiers to it. One, the intentionality of the deck building process is extremely optimized to the point where they're like net decking or doing things similar to net decking and editing a few pieces out based on, play style, local metas, tournament play, etc. And the competitive integrity of the player is extremely important as well. A lot of people playing CDH are playing in tournaments, so there are no spite plays. There is no king making. They are willing to go for draws, which people don't go for draws in casual commander. That's not a thing that happens, but in a tournament, you will go for draws in order to make a top 16 or so on. So I think that's one of the key distinguishing features of CEDH, which if you don't know if your deck is CEDH or not, then it's a 4. If you have intentions of making a CEDH list and you're maybe following the meta of your area or the like greater tournament meta, then it is more chance of being CEDH. It's all about the intentionality of it. And a lot of these decks are based on the intended gameplay experience. And if you're not intending on, playing in a tournament, so on and so forth. I mean, there is non-tournament CEDH, but if you're not going in with the intention of looking for that experience, then you're going to be in a different bracket. And that's just kind of how the system is intended to be interpreted, at least in my opinion. So moving past this, we have game changers. Now, game changers are a list of 40 extremely powerful, like format defining cards, whether it be for, potentially like salty reasons or most of the time it is for gameplay purposes. They're usually very extremely oppressive or they just win games on the spot and so on and so forth. So this is a way for Wizards to kind of monitor these cards or, to push these cards out of the lower power levels, whether it be for people doing it like in bad faith or new players not really understanding the gravity of that these cards carry. Yep, I'll pull up the list as well in terms. Let me see if I can scroll to it real quick. Here it is. I'm not going to read every single card, but just know most of these cards are very powerful. This is not a perfect list. I'll give my opinions on it real quick. This is not a perfect list. I think green and red need more cards in it. That's just a fact. Even though I do think those cards are generally weaker in a CDH space, but in terms of casual, I think these colors need a bit more representation, and there are some cards that just nobody plays, in my opinion, in this list, but they could potentially be removed and like rule zeroed out of the format. Gavin did mention that this is like a pseudo watch list in terms of bans, and I do think that is a pretty good thing for the most part. But yeah, I don't think the list is perfect. I don't think the system is perfect, but I think it's a very good start. So let's get right into the tiers now, because I've been rambling for already 10 minutes and we haven't even started ranking. So going on into the tier list, we have CEDH, then 4-3-2-1 in terms of how the brackets are laid out for my decks. So we're going to start, and I don't actually, this is like a random order. So starting with Senu, actually, Keen-Eyed Protector. This is my mono-white Legends, Vehicles, and Birds deck. It's kind of like a mono-white aggro deck. And this is like some goofy deck that I'm gonna make a video about this deck because I'm just absolutely in love with the mechanics of it. I think it's super fun to play. But in terms of the bracket system and the like power level of the deck, this is by far a 2. Absolutely a 2. It doesn't follow the thematic guidelines, in my opinion, to reach a 1, because the intent of this deck is to win. Though it runs 0 game changers. I think like I don't. It has one tutor, which is the War of the Last Alliance, and that is a Saga Legend creature tutor, that gives like combat benefit at the end. So yeah, this deck is not any more powerful than the average precon, in my opinion. I like to play this deck into precons, and it does so quite comfortably. So this is one of like the quintessential 2s. Most of my decks are 2s and 3s overall, but yep, this is one of my 2s. Deck is super fun. Really like playing it. Definitely a 2 in terms of precons. It runs no game changers. It runs no like potentially problematic stuff or any cards that I could consider being on the game changer list if it was ever increased upon. After that, we have Helga Skittish Seer. Now, this deck I think is also a 2, but I think it's stronger than Senu. This is a Bant Mana Dork big creatures deck. The intent of the deck is to ramp out, boost Helga as much as possible, and make an army of large green stompies. It runs a decent amount of interaction, 0 game changers, but it's really just big creatures. That's kind of the name of the game. I would say this is pretty akin to a precon as well. It might be slightly more powerful than the average precon, but if so, it's not by much. So I can comfortably put this deck into bracket 2. After that, we have Kaidel and Miara, and now this is a pretty interesting one. It's one of those awkward to place decks, in my opinion. In the end, I'm going to bracket 2 it. This is my Sultai Elf Aristocrats deck. It is a combo deck, and it aims to generate infinite mana with cards like Faces of the Past and Mana Dorks and sack outlets to generate infinite mana, and then I'll kill the table with something like Hurricane or maybe Exsanguinate. Just dump all that mana into an X spell, and then as I generate that infinite mana, I'm pinging the rest of the table and then gaining life with like Bastion of Remembrance, so on and so forth. The combo of this deck does require like 6 or so cards, and for me to untap and have both my commanders out, and it is non-deterministic, so the gameplay loop of the deck might not be the most enjoyable to play against, especially. But I don't think this deck is powerful enough to hit 3. It runs 0 game changers. Like I said, the most powerful cards in the deck are like Lathril, Wolverine Riders, and Faces of the Past. So definitely a 2. I don't play this deck against that many like precons because some people do not like non-deterministic looping. Though I don't think the power level and consistency of this deck warrants anything higher than a bracket 2. After that, we have Trin and Silvar. Now, this deck can be broken up into two different decks, either Trin and Silvar, which is like a humans Voltron commander, Voltron deck rather, or Queen Marchesa, which is like the Mardu. It would be a Mardu humans and monarchy deck. We're just gonna rate this as Trin and Silvar because that's the face commanders of it. And this deck is actually, I think, closer to a 3 than it is a 2, so I'm going to put it in 3. Now, this deck does run one Game Changer, and it is Winota, Joiner of Forces. I think Winota fits so perfectly in this deck that, it's a human deck with a non-human in the command zone, so it just takes advantage of Winota's ability extremely well. The deck is relatively hard to interact with, so besides just having one Game Changer, Silvar is pretty hard to interact with. I can give Silvar indestructible at instant speed and consistently, so even if you layer like 5 removal spells, I can still get past it. Even I can kill someone out of the game extremely, or not extremely, but pretty early for casual decks rather. The list is pretty decently optimized. I mean, it's on the slower end in terms of winning the game, but I can like I've one shot someone pretty early on with like Silvar and Jessica Thrice Reborn. So I wouldn't really like I think I could run this against precons as like the bracket is designed to potentially run against decks one bracket higher or lower. I could run this deck against precons, but I think on average I would run it into bracket 3 decks most of the time and feel the most comfortable that way. After that, we have Minthara, Merciless Soul. I'm putting this deck into 2. I think this deck is actually stronger slightly than my Helga deck. It is a bit slower in terms of like the ramping, but obviously I'm playing against like a Simic base, so that makes sense. What I think is more powerful in this deck than Helga is the utilization of tutors. I do run Saw in Half and Hoarding Broodlord. It is a very expensive combo to run, but it does allow me to tutor multiple times. I can flicker my Hoarding Broodlord as well with things like Ephemerate. So the tutor ability of this deck is a lot higher than the rest of the decks in 2, but I'm like the most powerful thing I'm getting from this is a Chroma's Will, which I think is a very, very powerful card. It's a good game ender. But I don't know if that is necessarily close to a game changer card in my opinion. It's just like another finisher like Crater Hoof or Moonshaker Cavalry, etc. Um, so I don't think this warrants this deck going up to a 3. I aim to make a bunch of tokens and then bump them up with, or buff them up rather, with Minthara's experience counter ability. Definitely like a pretty strong like battle cruiser style deck with aristocrats like payoffs, but pretty solidly precon-ish level, I would say. And yeah, no game changers to speak of. And then after this, we have Narcy. I would say Narcy is one of the harder decks for me to actually rank. I'm going to initially put her into 3. And the main reason why is because of the frequency of tutors in the deck. I think the fact that this deck does run like 4+ tutors in it is the reason why I would put this higher. It's not like running Enlightened Tutor. It runs 0 game changers, and this is another combo-ish deck. It does run a combo, but the combo is 6+ cards, and I need to untap with it, so pretty easy to interact with. Yeah, so this runs like War of the Last Alliance, and I think the Huntsman's Redemption, I believe, is the card. It runs Sterling Grove, so it doesn't run Enlightened Tutor or Idyllic Tutor. Doesn't run Vamp Tutor or any like the Game Changer tutors, as I mentioned before. But I do think this deck can. I actually feel more comfortable playing this deck into precons than I do Trin and Silvar. But I think as a general rule of thumb, I would put this deck probably closer to the 3s just because of the like consistency aspect of it and the fact that I am tutoring a decent amount and I do have tutors to get the combo, though it, as I mentioned before, it's not the most efficient combo. Okay, next up we got Atla Palani. And at Laplani, this is a deck I made for my wife. It is a pretty much pure dinosaurs list. I do run a few non-dinosaurs, but I'm not running any Eldrazi. I'm running a lot of like vanilla creatures, like that new Terrian from Ether Drift, and also like Colossal Dreadmaw, stuff like that. It does have some pretty powerful cards in it in terms of like just raw creature power. And the snowballing of this deck can get pretty out of hand, more so than something like Helga. The fact that I don't really need cards in hand for Atla Plenty to pop off. Like I could just be her and an egg, and I could just go from having 2 power on the board to having like 40 power on the board in a single turn. Like it's just luck of the draw. So I'm actually gonna put Atlaplani slightly higher than Narcy. In terms of like card quality, I'm running no game changers in this list. I do think. I mean, I think you could potentially make the argument for bracket 2, but yeah, I'm running like Atali Primal Conqueror, Zopandrel Hunger Dominus, and like the new Galta Stampede Tyrant. So those are pretty powerful cards, I would say. And the fact that I could cheat them onto the board as early as like turn 3 is pretty insane. So yeah, in terms of like the variance aspect of Commander and Magic in general, I think this deck is probably closer to a 3. I do feel comfortable running it into like the more upgraded precons level, or like the uh, decks with game changers and so on, and like late game combos. I'd feel comfortable running Atla there. I'm actually gonna shift Minthar and Helga. I think Helga's a bit more consistent, despite the finishing capability of Minthara. But yeah, next up we have Neath of the Dire Hunt. Neath is a Gruul control list that focuses on the fight mechanic, and it's also a budget deck. So Neath has gone up in price pretty significantly because just Neath as a card is like $11 now, or $12, when before it was like under $1 or so, or like $1 or $2. So the aside discounting Neath herself, the deck is like $30. So this is definitely I think my weakest deck that I own. It is a low 2 or whatever. It's like at the bottom end of the 2s in terms of the decks that I have ordered. I am very comfortable playing this into precons, and actually I think it gets outpaced by precons, like the average precon nowadays. But yeah, it's a pretty like control focused, like card advantage focused Gruul list. I just get some big creatures out there, or even like moderately like well statted green creatures, and then I fight spell. So it's just creatures and fight spells. So Nanthe is quite fun. I used to play the deck quite a bit back in like 2023-ish. And yeah. Moving along, we have Eloise Nephalia Sleuth. I think this deck is another one between 2 and 3. It's pretty hard to gauge, though. I think I would put this closer to top of 2 for my deck lists. Bracket 2, I think this deck runs. I could see this deck, it's like around $100-ish in value, so pretty similar to where people, like the designers, make their precons. I think this deck is on par with a fair amount of the average precon lists. It is a like artifacts deck that has a combo finish, Academy Manufacturer, Cauldron Familiar, a Sack Outlet, and Eloise. That's 4 cards, and close to like 11 mana ish. That's like an 11 mana 5-card combo, or 4-card combo. So I think that falls into the criteria of a combo that can fit in a precon level deck. Like I don't think this deck can hang well with some of like the Eldrazi precons, or I think it gets outpaced by like the Elevir, like Wilds of Eldraine precon, for example, or like even the Zinnia deck. Like I think the Zinnia deck can beat this up pretty well. Um, but yeah, I think it's hard to gauge combo decks specifically in terms of the 2 to 3 aspect, but due to the nature of the combo and how on board it is and how easy it is to interact with, I would say like at least interact with the pieces rather before they're out. I would say this deck is like the strongest, maybe one of the strongest, yeah, the strongest not precon level deck I have. And yeah, uh I think you could make the argument for 3 though, but I usually play this in the 2-ish area, and it does pretty well. Okay, so after that we have a Layla. This is like the quintessential 3, I think, in terms of the decks that I own. It runs 2 game changers. It is quite aggressive. It is like your classic Esper, Alayla enchantment list. I'm putting this above the rest of my other 3s. And it is the game changers I run are Enlightened Tutor and Smothering Tithe. It's an enchantment focused tutor, of course, and I mainly get Kindred Discovery for the card draw. And then Smothering Tithe is, I mean, it's just a solid white enchantment. I'm aiming for this to be a 3 in the intention of the deck building, and I had a Smothering Tithe, so this is the deck I put it in. Yeah, Alayla is herself is quite the powerful face, or like legend creature rather. She's quite powerful. She can threaten pretty heavily with commander damage because she's like a flying death touch lifelinker. I mean, she just smokes people if I put in all that glitters on her. Uh, and flyers are just pretty hard to deal with in general for a lot of people. Like this just generates so many flyers. It draws so many cards just based on all of the reconnaissance missions and Kindred Discovery effects and like curiosity type effects in it. So the card advantage and the mana advantage I can potentially get from the stack are pretty high. Solid value engine, solid beaters, absolutely a 3, I think, in terms of what I, in my eyes, envision a power 3 or bracket 3 deck, rather. Ooh, spicy one next. We got Emery, Lurker of the Lock. Now, this is, I mean, I'm not even going to beat around the bush on this one. This one's a 4. This one's absolutely a 4. This is the strongest deck I own. It can win. It has the capabilities to win on turn 1. Though I would need like 5 or 6 of the perfect cards in my hand to do so. So this is a 4. It runs 2 game changers. It runs Fierce Guardianship and the One Ring. So very powerful cards, of course. It runs a pretty solid suite of interaction. I don't run Force of Will, though. And I don't run Mana Drain because I don't own those cards, although Mana Drain is not a game changer, but that's, I think, debatable on the fact in terms of like power level. It does, the gameplay strategy is I mill myself out and then I win with Jace Wielder of Mysteries or Laboratory Maniac. I do not run Thassa's Oracle, as I mentioned in the Game Changers list. This deck is pretty hard to interact with because, you know, Emery has affinity for artifacts, basically, so I can just keep getting her out, even though she's a removal magnet. I have infinite combos with Mirror and Spy. I can infinitely loop extra turn spells with Codex Shredder, and I run 4 extra turn spells in the deck, including Nexus of Fate. Yeah, the deck is very powerful. It is very, very powerful. It very easily wins on like turn 5 in like a real game setting, or turn 6. She's being removed a lot, and yeah, like I said, it has the capabilities of winning just like on turn 3 or on turn 2, on turn 1, whatever. This is not a CDH list, though. This is not a competitive deck in that regard. I think Emery, in terms of the current meta, is just completely outclassed. I think a few years ago, like, and a few, I mean like 6 years ago, she was even further back. She was like a very fringe CEDH list. But monocolor in general is extremely rare in CEDH. There's only a few like very prominent monocolor CEDH commanders. Crick, Son of Yawgmoth. Magda is extremely powerful. Magda is up there for sure. She's like top of the meta. And if you were gonna run mono blue, you'd run like either Teferi or Urza Lord High Artificer. Emery just feeds Rhystic Study too hard. She feeds Mystic Remora way too hard. She has way too many interaction points. Like, she's just so easy to deal with in terms of like a CDH space. And cycling extra turns is not something that is very common in terms of the winning strategy. In terms of like the powerful cards that she runs that aren't game changers, like she's running Valley Flood Caller, she's running Born Upon the Wind. Like, those are both extremely powerful cards. I can win the game on someone's end step if I flash in, if I instant speed Born Upon the Wind, so on and so forth. Like, I could just like win on someone else's turn, which is very powerful, which is a strategy that is seen in CEDH, but like I said before, Emery is just not at that caliber in my opinion. She's definitely a 4, one of my favorite decks of all time, and one of the only 2 decks that I consider to be a bracket 4 in terms of what I own. So enough about Emery. Let's go to Lila, Undefeated Slickshot. This is my Is It budget prowess deck and plot and prowess. So with her, I aim to stack expensive Is It spells like Magma Opus, Prophetic Bolts. That one, it's like the research spell with like Rowan and Will, like reading books and stuff. I forget the name of it. Forgive me. I just stack those into plot. I make a large army of tokens with like Murmuring Mystic, Mischievous Mystic, and Talrand. I give them buffs with prowess like Bria, Riptide Rogue, or Balmor. I cast all those spells from plot, and then I swing in with combat damage, and I utilize a lot of like interaction and combat tricks, so on, to kill the table. This deck is quite efficient in terms of its, monetary investment to power level. I think this is, out of all of the decks that I own, if I made a precon and designed a precon, it would be this deck. This deck is so sick. It's very fun to play. I think if you had a higher budget or no budget restriction with this commander, she'd be extremely fun and powerful. But for me, I kept her around 50-ish bucks. And yeah, this is like, if someone pulls out precons, they want to play precons, this is one of the first decks I think about. And I think she's very comfortable in bracket 2, exactly where I want her to be. Now, in terms of like the angle shooting and things that I was talking about before, I think Marchesa is like one of the best examples of this. Marchesa runs 0 game changers. She runs 1 card that could potentially be seen as a game changer, and when I checked Moxfield to see where she was placed, she's actually placed in bracket 2. But the bracket implementation on these deck builder websites, they don't really account for the context of the deck and like the play patterns. They only account for what they can, and that is game changers and the rules like the mass land denial, extra turns, and so on. This deck does not qualify for any of that. It has, like I said, no game changers, 1 extra turn spell, so it doesn't loop them. So this deck could be a 2. But if I were to call it a 2, I feel like it would be disingenuous, and I feel like it would be kind of angle shooting to pub stomp people. I would not play this deck against precons. This deck is a easy 3. And I think it might be actually it's the 4th strongest deck I own, I think, in terms of the intentionality behind it, how optimized I made it. It just doesn't have the same punch as a bracket 4 deck. I could make this deck a bracket 4. I could make Marchesa a CEDH list. And in fact, I do have a CEDH list for Marchesa, Dealer of Death, but I don't have it in person. I just built it online just as like a deck building exercise. But yeah, so this Marchesa list, it aims to swing out and animate a bunch of these like cheap 1 or 2 mana artifacts with Cyberdrive Awakener. It can win by milling itself out with Laboratory Maniac. It has an extra turn spell, Temporal Trespass, to make use of her discarding ability. I fill the graveyard extremely fast, so using Delve to kind of take advantage of that is a solid synergy piece. That way I can just play a bunch of artifacts, then take an extra turn, Cyberdrive Awakener. Now they don't have Summoning Sickness. That's like the main purpose of that. And yeah, this deck just storms off like incredibly well with like Joyra, Weatherlight Captain, and like any artifact cost reducers. Like Mystic Forge as well. I can play out things off the top and just like machine gun through my deck at incredible speeds. It runs Deflecting Swat, which is the card I mentioned before in terms of like a card that could be a game changer, depending on how people feel about free interaction. It has Hullbreaker, Horror, plus Soul Ring in terms of its combo ability. It does run Unwinding Clock, which can be an extremely oppressive card in artifact-based strategies, though I don't think it is even pseudo game changer level. But yeah, this deck is very powerful. It can be quite oppressive. I have a deck tech about it, though I need to update it because the deck has changed somewhat significantly since then. And yeah, I think this is like the perfect example of like, it follows the criteria of a 2, but it's really a 3. Like if you've played against this deck, and a lot of my people in my play group can vouch for me, I think this deck is like absolutely just a 3, like without question, really. Anyways, the last 2 decks, we have Massacre Girl. Now, Massacre Girl could also be a 4 because of the play pattern, but in terms of I think the actual like on paper strength of the deck, it's a 3. Yeah, I think it's like on par with Marchesa Dealer of Death, but the fact that there's a board wipe in the command zone that I can repeat over and over again, that is a play pattern that is more cutthroat. I don't really play her that way anyways, but people might go into the game and get what they weren't really expecting with this deck, if that makes any sense. But I think in terms of like the bracket system, she is a 3. I run no game changers in the list. I do run some decent combos with like Son Half Broodlord. I do have like a Cabal Coffers in the deck. The deck aims to like control the board with Massacre Girl and then go with Gary loops or Rise of the Dark Realms, reanimation strategies, so on and so forth. This is like one of the top bracket 3 decks I think that I own, because the play pattern can be pretty obnoxious to deal with, and I don't think I can actually hang with bracket 4 decks. I've played against bracket 4 decks with this deck and I have won, so it's not out of the question. But I think on a general basis, this deck is a 3. Now, I've alluded to it before, but the second bracket 4 deck I own and have built is Rowan, Scion of War. Now, Rowan is definitely a 4. This is a Dragonstorm list. So I have a bunch of tutors in the deck. I run 2 game changers, which are Vampiric Tutor and Jeska's Will. Now, yeah, this deck runs a bunch of tutors. I run like Gamble. I'm running Final Parting. I'm running Vamp Tutor, as I said before. And Dragonstorm is a tutor inherently itself. So the purpose of the deck is to storm off, drain my own life total, use Rowan's ability, Dragonstorm, tutor 9-ish dragons onto the board. The final one being, or one of the early ones being Terror of the Peaks, and one of the later ones being Nullspine Dragon. I will basically do like 200 damage to players in a single turn, and then I have the potential to draw as many cards as I want with the Nullspine Dragon interaction. And since all of my also sorry, actually I do run a third game changer, and that is Bolus's Citadel. Yeah, as I was saying before, I just tutor a bunch of dragons on the battlefield. I do a ton of damage to the face and burn, and then if anybody's still alive after that, I will use haste enablers like Song of Totentons or like Dragon Lord Kolaghan and kill the rest of the table or the rest of the remaining players with dragon combat damage. So this deck is very potent. I have the ability to win on like turn 3, and I have won on turn 3 or 4 before. It is very explosive, and I don't think this is a deck I would absolutely never in like a million years play against a precon. The deck is extremely snowbally. It can just win out of nowhere, and it is very powerful. So it also follows the Wizard of the Coast given guidelines of a bracket 4 deck. You could potentially, I guess, make an argument for 3, but I feel like that'd be in bad faith. So I've placed it in bracket 4 as one of the 2 of my strongest decks. Now, you may have noticed I have no bracket 1 deck, and then I don't have any CEDH lists. My play group does not play CEDH, though I have wrestled with and flirted with the idea of playing CEDH. My local scene doesn't have any really like that many CEDH players, at least to the stores that I go to. And I don't really feel like printing out and proxying a whole CEDH list, though. I would play Marchesa Dealer of Death if that was the case. I know there are a few people actually from, or 1 or 2 people from the New England scene that do run a solid list. I basically made a Underworld Breach deck with Marchesa, and she does make use of Underworld Breach pretty disgustingly well because she fills the graveyard really well as well. But yeah, like Brain Freeze, LED, Underworld Breach, so on. You get the gist of it if you know CEDH at all. And yeah, so that's going to be it. I don't really feel like I've already talked about my opinions on the bracket system, but the last thing I do want to say is I think Wizards and the CFP did a very good job with this system. I hated the 1 to 10 scale. I thought it was super obnoxious, and it just gave people the opportunity to be bad actors or, dodge the Rule Zero conversation. I think this is a great way to get people to start talking about their, like, what they want out of the game of Commander and the power level. Though, as Gavin has mentioned multiple times, it will not stop bad actors and people who are in bad faith and trying to pub stomp. So yeah, overall, like the new system. Definitely have been giving it a try in my game stores and on Spell Table to good effect, actually. Very, very much happy with this. Hopefully, y'all enjoyed watching the ranking of the videos. I'm going to make some more. I started a new full time job, so it's been hard to make videos and find the time and the energy to do so, but trying to make a Senu video as soon as possible because holy crap, I love this deck so much. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching. And please let me know how you feel about the commander bracket system in the comments if you want to, talk about that. And have a nice week. Peace out.